Before Trump invaded Venezuela, there was Iraq and Afghanistan, Cuba, Bay of Pigs, Korea, Vietnam. The justifications are interesting, as United States makes justifications for Caracas.
The U.S. bombardment of Venezuela and the capture of its president Nicolas Maduro follows a long history of interventions in South and Central America and the Caribbean over the past 2 centuries. Hello and welcome. You're watching Explained. I'm Devika Devan. Today we're diving into how the United States has historically justified military interventions and coups from the annexation of Texas, the Cold War era, to more recent conflicts. Trump's pressure campaign is the latest chapter in a long history of U.S. intervention in the Caribbean basin, rooted in the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, but fully realized in the 20th century, ostensibly to protect U.S. interests and counter communism. But since the mid-19th century, the U.S. has intervened in its continental neighbors not only through economic pressure but also militarily, with a long list of invasions, occupations, and in the case most closely resembling the current situation, the capture of Panama's dictator Manuel Noriega in 1989. American soldiers have been deployed abroad almost continuously since the end of the Second World War. The best-known foreign interventions are Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. They were large, long, and costly. But there have been dozens of other such deployments, many smaller and shorter, for purposes ranging from deterrence to training. Taken as a whole, these operations have had a decidedly mixed record. Some, such as Operation Desert Storm in 1991, which swept the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's forces out of Kuwait, largely succeeded. But others, such as those in Somalia, Haiti, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere, were disappointments or outright failures. Covert actions helped topple democratically elected governments and usher in military dictatorships in countries such as Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. But overt U.S. military operations have historically been confined to closer neighbors in Central America and the Caribbean. First, the annexation of Texas, a former Mexican territory, sparked border disputes that led to a U.S. invasion of Mexico, with American troops occupying the capital, Mexico City, in 1847. The war ended only with the signing of a treaty in 1848 that forced Mexico to cede 55% of its territory, an area encompassing what are now the states of California, Nevada, and Utah, as well as parts of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Then Cuba. Shortly after taking office in 1961, President John F. Kennedy approved a covert plan to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro, who had grown increasingly aligned with the Soviet Union since seizing power 2 years earlier. The secret operation, originally developed under the Eisenhower administration, relied on a force of about 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles who were expected to seize the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast and spark a popular uprising against Castro. Instead, the Bay of Pigs invasion ended in disaster. Castro ordered some 20,000 troops to the beach, forcing most of the US-backed invasion force to surrender. More than 100 were killed. The incident became a major embarrassment for the United States. The Bay of Pigs convicted Castro and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev that the United States would attempt another invasion of Cuba. Castro convinced Khrushchev that he needed Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba to deter further US aggression, precipitating the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The resulting confrontation of the missiles brought the US and the Soviet Union at the brink of nuclear war before Kennedy and Khrushchev worked out a delicate compromise that averted a direct conflict between the two superpowers. The US received control of Puerto Rico and occupied Cuba until 1902, when an agreement granted the US Navy perpetual control of the Guantanamo Bay. US troops later occupied the island from 1906 to 1909 and again from 1917 to 1922. After Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution, the CIA backed the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 in an attempt to trigger an uprising. The US justified it as a preemptive strike against communism spreading in the Western Hemisphere. Then there's Haiti, under the pretext of stabilizing the country and protecting US business interests after domestic unrest that led to repeated overthrow of Haitian leaders. The US invaded Haiti in 1915, taking control of customs, the treasury and the national bank until 1934. When an attempted rebellion threatened the dictator Francois Papadoc Duvalier in 1959, the CIA worked behind the scenes to secure his survival, viewing him as an ally in containing the influence of Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution. In Brazil, although it ultimately never intervened, a US naval task force was positioned off the Brazilian coast to intervene in case there was resilience to the military coup that overthrew the democratically elected left-wing president João Goulart in 1964. In the 1970s, the CIA and the FBI directly advised the repressive apparatus of dictatorships in countries such as Brazil, Chile, and Argentina in the persecution and assassination of dissidents under what became known as Operation Condor. Next is the 1989 invasion of Panama. The US military backed the separatist movement that led to Panama's break from Colombia in 1903, and after independence, Washington retained significant influence over the Central American country. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush ordered Panama's invasion by about 2,700 US troops to capture the dictator Noriega, a former CIA ally who had been indicted on drug trafficking charges in US courts. Hours after the strikes, in which an estimated 500 civilians were killed, along with about 300 Panama soldiers, the US installed the declared winner of the election, Guillermo Endara, as president. President George H.W. Bush justified it as protecting 35,000 Americans in Panama, combating drug threats to US society, and upholding treaties after Noriega declared war on the US and his forces killed a US Marine. Noriega surrendered after seeking asylum in the Vatican embassy. Listen in to what Bush had said.
Last night, I ordered U.S. military forces to Panama. No president takes such action lightly. This morning, I want to tell you what I did and why I did it. For nearly 2 years, the United States, the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean have worked together to resolve the crisis in Panama. The goals of the United States have been to safeguard the lives of Americans, to defend democracy in Panama, to combat drug trafficking, and to protect the integrity of the Panama Canal Treaty. Many attempts have been made to resolve this crisis through diplomacy and negotiations. All were rejected by the dictator of Panama, General Manuel Noriega, an indicted drug trafficker.
That sounds familiar, right? Well, Bush justified his surveillance, deportation, and torture regime by claiming it was all required to keep Americans safe. Trump used this Bush-era classic to justify the invasion of Venezuela. In Vietnam, the US involvement escalated from advisors to full war, justified by the domino theory. If South Vietnam fell to communism, Southeast Asia would follow, threatening US allies and global stability. Presidents from Truman to Johnson cited containing Soviet and Chinese influence. The 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, where North Vietnamese boats allegedly attacked US ships, provided the trigger. Congress passed a resolution authorizing force, though later reports questioned the attack's severity. The war ended in 1957 with North Vietnam's victory after massive US losses. The 2001 invasion of Afghanistan was a direct response to 9/11. The US justified it as a self-defense act under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Al-Qaeda, harbored by the Taliban, attacked America. President Bush demanded the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden. When they refused, Operation Enduring Freedom began with airstrikes and special forces aiding anti-Taliban groups. It was framed as dismantling terrorist networks to prevent future attacks and not regime change initially, though that's what it led to. The 2003 Iraq War was justified primarily by claims of weapons of mass destruction. President George W. Bush stated Iraq possesses and produces chemical and biological weapons and is seeking nuclear weapons, posing an imminent threat. Vice President Cheney said there is no doubt Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction to use against allies. Secretary Powell told the UN Iraq had mobile bioweapon labs and ties to Al-Qaeda. The administration argued regime change would democratize the Middle East, prevent terrorism, and enforce UN resolutions that Iraq had violated post the 91 Gulf War. Listen in to what George W. Bush had said.
I take the threat very seriously. I take the fact that he develops weapons of mass destruction very seriously. I remember the fact that he has invaded 2 countries before. I know for a fact that he's poisoned his own people. He doesn't believe in the worth of each individual. He doesn't believe in public dissent.
But no WMDs were found, leading to accusations of intelligence failures or exaggeration. Bush later said that it was about freedom from tyranny. Over 4,000 US troops died. The war lasted until 2011. As Defense Secretary, Hegseth has called the recent Venezuela operation the exact opposite of Iraq. In Iraq, US troops spent blood and treasure for decades with no economic gain. In Venezuela, it's about freedom, security, and capturing Maduro on drug charges. Listen in.
We spent decades and decades and purchased in blood and got nothing economically in return. And President Trump flips the script. He says through strategic action, we can ensure that we have access to additional wealth and resources, enabling a country to unleash that without having to spend American blood. I mean, this was a bold and audacious move.
In Syria, US interventions since 2014 have focused on countering ISIS, justified as self-defense against terrorism. Obama authorized airstrikes without UN approval, citing humanitarian needs to avert catastrophe from Assad's chemical weapons. Trump continued aiding strikes on Iranian-backed militias. Libya's 2011 intervention was under UN Resolution 1973 to protect civilians from Gaddafi's forces during the Arab Spring. Obama said it was the right thing, but regime change ensued. The justification given was that it was prevent massacres and support democracy. Recently, the US strikes in Nigeria targeted ISIS affiliates, justified as counterterrorism in partnership with Nigeria. Trump called it a Christmas present to stop attacks on Christians, but Nigeria emphasized it's not religious, stating it was a joint operation against extremists threatening stability. The United States has historically offered various justifications for its invasions and support for coups. From Cuba's Bay of Pigs, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Panama, Iraq, Syria, Libya, to recent strikes in Nigeria. For Venezuela, US justifications centered on Maduro as a narco-terrorist, threatening US security through drugs and instability. History repeats itself.
Before Trump invaded Venezuela, there was Iraq and Afghanistan, Cuba, Bay of Pigs, Korea, Vietnam. The justifications are interesting, as United States makes justifications for Caracas.